Good afternoon. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to acknowledge that the land Getty inhabits today was once known as Tavangar, the home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people as well as all First people past, present, and future, and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. Getty commits to building relationships with the Gabrielino Tongva community, and we invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us for caring for it. I'm Greg Sandoval of the Getty Museum Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Converging Lenses, Contemporary Responses to 19th Century Photography. This program complements two current exhibitions currently on view at the Getty, 19th Century Photography Now, and Hippolyte Bayard, A Persistent Pioneer. Both exhibitions are on view at the Center for Photographs through July 22nd, and the galleries today will be open until 5:30. You'll hear more about the exhibition shortly from our curator, Carolyn Peter, as we begin today's conversation. But before we begin, I have a few notes. For guests here in the lecture hall, please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. For online attendees, closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on the Zoom menu button at the bottom of the screen. And time permitting, we will take some questions. For online audience, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom menu bar. And for those here in the auditorium, there will be a mic available for you to ask your question. And now I would like to turn the program over to exhibition curator, Photographs curator, Carolyn Peter.
Thank you. Are you guys hearing me okay? There we go, okay. Greetings to all those here in the auditorium and to those in Zoom land. So great to have you here on this Sunday afternoon. One small correction to what Greg said, the show is on view until July 7th. So we've got couple less weeks than he thought. But so get yourself down here and see the show. I hope you here in the audience have seen it already, or we'll get a chance to see it once we're done. We're in for a real treat today. It's my privilege to be part of this conversation with Laura Larson, Palma Pagi-Sipuya, and Stephanie Siuko. And I want to thank Greg, Danielle Alvarez, Philip Beckoff, and Paul Peters for all you've done to make today happen. And I don't have my clicker. One sec. So here's just our kind of big title wall, or intro wall in the Center for Photographs downstairs. Former Getty Associate Curator Karen Hellman conceived of 19th Century Photography Now, and it's been my honor to have seen this exhibition through to fruition over the past year. Karen and I are grateful to Claire LaRue and Antares Wells, who wrote the 19th century labels, and to all our Getty colleagues who helped realize this exhibition. At the heart of this exhibition is the idea that 19th century photography has a resonance with 21st century artists today. We were surprised to learn how many contemporary artists are using 19th century photography as a point of departure in their work. We hope you will agree that ideas from early photography are still very relevant to us today. They are very current. The ideologies are still circulating, and it's exciting to see how so many contemporary artists are exploring and interrogating these pictures from the 19th century. Here's a list of all the 21 21st century artists, and they are paired in 19th century photography now with 33 artists from the 19th century. The exhibition is arranged, this is part of the introduction to the show, and as I said, each 19th century work is paired with a 21st century artist, or vice versa. There are 5 themes that the exhibition is organized around: identity, how we create our own identity through photography, and how others have formed and classified our identities with photography. The next theme is time. Time is such an integral element of photography. The 19th century photographers were working so hard to create this whole technology and art form in order to capture a moment in time and in order to capture an image from reality. There's also the aspect of the fleetingness of early photography and how it faded. And some of the 21st century artists are also playing with that idea of fleetingness. Another idea around time is how to capture movement in time, as in Liz Duchesne and Etienne Jules Marais. The third theme is spirit, and kind of focuses on our real human desire to make the invisible visible, and a desire to connect to our loved ones who have passed away and to our heritage. The fourth theme is landscapes, thinking about how images of land have been used to promote expansionism and imperialism, and how traces of history, of conflict, of wounds can be found in the land. And the last theme is circulation, and we're thinking about how quickly and widely photography spread, and how photographs change in meaning as they circulate, and as they are collected and cataloged and categorized. So first, we're going to give you a little introduction to each of these 3 artists' works here who are with us today. We're going to start with Laura Larson, and she's written about her work that she's mining the intersection between politics and poetics. She says, "My work looks to photography's history as a documentary practice to tell personal and socio-cultural narratives. The assumption of objectivity that continues to haunt photography, the desire to trust our eyes, is a generative concern." She has exhibited extensively at the Centre Georges Pompidou, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and the Wexner Center for the Arts. Her works are in collections such as the New York Public Library, the Whitney, the Met, and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. Her first book, Hidden Mothers, was shortlisted for the Aperture Perry Photo First Photo Book Prize, and a new edition of Hidden Mothers should be coming out soon, with fingers crossed. Her second book, City of Incurable Women, was published in 2022, and she lives in Columbus, Ohio. So Laura, my first question for you is kind of broad. Just in terms of thinking of your series, City of Incurable Women, how did you gravitate towards these images and towards Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot's photographs and work with these women in the 19th century in Paris at the Hôpital de la Piété Salpêtrière?
I know it's a mouthful. Should I take the clicker?
Sure, would you like to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I can go through the images and then we can
that's great.
refer back. So the 2 images on the right, which are included in the installation in the show, those are called signals. How did I gravitate towards it? I would say all of my work in the past 20 years has been an engagement with the beginnings of the medium as we know it, and thinking about, like, trying to sort of think about the history of photography less as a kind of progressive line and more as a kind of looping in which we can kind of understand, not only have a deeper understanding of the medium itself, but also our relationship to history. So I got interested in these images. I feel like I almost, like from the very beginnings of my education as a photographer, was exposed to these images. A teacher who was very important to me, Mary Kelly, made this kind of phenomenal work, which is called Corpus, which was about these photographs. I was introduced to them through that, through, as a student taking my first sort of critical theory classes and, feminist critical theory. So I feel like they've kind of always been in the groundwater. And a lot of the images, like this one, for example, this was in a very sort of famous surrealist document that came out in, I want to say 1928, but please don't quote me on that. So I was just really fascinated by these images in the sense that they were produced in the context of a photo studio in a hospital that was treating women who had been diagnosed with hysteria. And the director of the hospital, Charcot, he, sort of understood how photography could be important to sort of diagnostics in medicine. So he built a studio in the hospital, which, like, to me sounds like it's so like bonkers, And the images themselves, so on one hand, like, knowing what we know about the technology, they were clearly staged, and yet at the same time they were making a kind of claim about how the surface of the body could sort of give you information about someone's mental health. And so I kind of like started from there. Should I keep going?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's hear some more about
These
your
are
work.
the first images that I made in the project. These are 8x10 ambrotypes. And for the most part, what I did was I isolated some of the gestures in the photographs of the women. And so rather than thinking about this relationship between the photographer and the subject, or in this case, how it sort of overlaid with the relationship between the doctor and the patient, I, was thinking about the hospital being a community of women where oftentimes, like, there were up to 2,000 women there. And, like, to begin to think about, like, could I understand some of these gestures as a kind of semaphore of communication between the women? And from there, like, it really sort of grew out into thinking, while I was looking critically at these photographs, at the same time, I wanted something more in terms of imagining not only like the kind of depth and texture of these women's lives, but what their relationship was to each other, and if there are ways to sort of understand through these photographs, and then how I was using them as a kind of springboard to sort of imagine a kind of resistance to some of the narratives that were being told about them, like both at that time and historically. So the image Sisters of the two glass negatives, these were negatives that were produced at Salpêtrière. And oftentimes the women who worked in the hospital had been patients, and so for the most part, these were the women who were kind of caring for the patients. And so again, like, I was trying to imagine these, like the sort of care between the women, like solidarity, desire, like all of these different facets of, like, any human being's life. This piece is called The Mind is a Muscle. This is also in the exhibition. A lot of what I was doing was to actually sort of resist the sort of notion of identity by turning the face away from the camera, and then beginning to kind of choreograph or pose my subjects, to sort of think about, this came up during our lunch, but like sort of thinking about like multiple sort of expressions within the body or ambivalence. Mirror cycle fists, there are a lot of references to the Judson School of Dance from the 1960s, and thinking about how to integrate like kind of everyday movement into dance. And so that was sort of like another kind of point of triangulation to sort of bring into the research. And again, like thinking about these photographs, this history, and why they were relevant in the present. I should also say that I was making this work during the Trump administration, and where these sort of languages about hysteria and women being out of control were, kind of becoming normalized, or at least sort of circulating more widely again. And so I think of looking at this history as like deeply relevant at that time and ongoing. I was working with some dancers, but mostly just kind of amateurs, like, folks who were taking a dance class for relaxation. And I began to kind of create these scripts where women, where we were using different cues. Sometimes they were images, sometimes they were pieces of the case histories of the women, sometimes it was just some writing that I would do to kind of prompt different kinds of movement. And it really it moved from working with one person to two to these kind of massive groups of people. And again, this sort of notion of solidarity, or imagining this as a community rather than a series of singular patients, was kind of what I was working towards. I think that's my last image.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. So we'll just move on with a little more introduction to everybody's work. Next, we've got Paul. Whoa, what happened there? Oh dear, what did I do? There we go. Okay. Don't give me any technology. Okay. So Paul's work is situated in the identity section, which we've discussed is both a loaded word and a word that doesn't mean anything these days in a lot of ways. And let's see, where's my introduction to Paul? Dun, dun, dun. Here we go. Paul has said, I make photographs, books, and installations rooted in portraiture, homoerotic visual culture, and the function of the studio. Portraiture is the foundation of my practice. The subjects appearing in my work are a cast of friends, intimates, and muses. They are founded in ongoing relationships mediated by the making and production of photographs. Palma Pagisupuya's works are in the collection of the Getty, the Guggenheim, the Hammer, LACMA, MoMA, SF MoMA, Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney, the Tate Modern, and the Victorian Albert Museum, among others. Recent museum exhibitions include those at the Barbican Center, the Guggenheim Museum, the Getty Museum, the Whitney Museum, and SF MoMA. And he lives here in Los Angeles and is an associate professor in media arts and MFA program director at the University of California, San Diego. Whoosh. Okay, and just one more little kind of connection, just Paul, his work is in 19th century photography now. He also is connected to the Hippolyte Bayard, a persistent pioneer exhibition, and this book, Hippolyte Bayard and the Invention of Photography. Karen Hellman and I had a lovely conversation with Paul and about the 19th century and about Hippolyte Bayard in particular, and about Paul's practice. And that is a section here in the book, along with some kind of a photo essay as well. So, Paul, I will give you the clicker in a second. My question for you is, the artist studio has been an important subject and critical participant in your work. We also see Hippolyte Bayard featuring his studio. And here's a couple other images of yours of your studio that actually has an image by Bayard reflected in the mirror, and another work by you called From Your Darkroom Studio series that has kind of, you might deny it and you can tell us more about it, but it definitely makes me think of Hippolyte Bayard's Drowned Man. So I want to ask you, how do your images transform the studio and the portrait into something very different from what they represented in Bayard's work? Or how are you thinking about something different?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Good question. I think maybe it's kind of a Mary Kelly connection, because I didn't know you studied with Mary Kelly, and also too, yeah. But I think that it's like this question of like everything outside of the frame. It's like there's like a cultural frame, there's a historical frame, there's things that we may be conscious of or we step into and we don't realize that we're in that space. The Bayard, I guess maybe I'll go back to this one, because I was thinking a lot about this photograph of Bayard's in response to Barrett, who is sitting there reaching out and us beginning conversation on a portfolio of saltpaper prints just before COVID or so. It was like around that time, and then I started thinking about this stuff, and then I guess I will jump to this image on the right, Darkroom Studio, because yeah, in a way I would say it is a reference in some way to Bayard's self-portrait as a drowned man. This one, though, is from 2021, and in the initial images that I was thinking about that come from the spring of 2020, when being sort of like invited to think about 19th century photography came about, and I was always very resistant to that for many reasons. I was just saying over lunch that as an undergrad, I was like really like, what do I have anything to think about these like old, I was just obsessed with like pop culture and Interview magazine and like fashion in New York, you know? But circumstances in 2020, the 19th century, thinking about Bayard's work, and that image kind of haunted me as COVID hit, and as thinking about the like of George Floyd, and me misreading Bayard's photograph and thinking that his farmer's tan was perhaps a dramatization of how visually drowning would look. It was interesting to actually realize that he was just gardening and very covered up. And I was beginning gardening at the same time. And so this image on the left, like these studios were outside. They weren't interior studios. This is set up in his garden. But also I was thinking about like the frivolity, and maybe thinking about why I didn't connect to 19th century photography, where it's like, you know, there's a sense of kind of like, I know it's like a dramatic, he's like really dramatic, you know, but it's also like a sense of frivolity of like in 1840 making an image of yourself drowned and thinking like, where are like millions of people drowning in the center of the Atlantic Ocean and the transatlantic slave trade, and just sort of like maybe coming into things in a different way might open up a conversation, but just as sort of like resting with it. But let me move to my pictures, because I think it's also like I was really like angry at the time, and I can't remember if you had seen some of those images, because I never produced them. I made a few tests. I withheld showing them to you.
I'm trying to remember. I mean, I certainly
yeah,
saw
no
images
yeah.
with Bayard integrated, you know, his images or the plants and things like that. But I don't know if I ever saw any that you were, I think you might not have.
I made a series of pictures, but they were too upsetting for me to follow through with, because I was thinking about the duration of Bayard sitting for those images, but also the duration of time of the strangulation of George Floyd, and trying to work up to holding my breath for that amount of time. And I was like, I can't kind of go through with that. So I never showed them to anyone. But I ended up moving studios, and this thing of like history was kind of lingering. And so this is an image from 1870 of a studio, and I was looking at these objects that, again, you know, this time period is coinciding with like this peak Western European colonization, carving up and claiming of Africa, of South Asia, Central Asia, and all of these things, and the objects in them kind of being indicative of this moment of conquest. And so I started gathering things. Like this has several objects that I borrowed from friends. My friend Sylvia has lots of interesting, she has a great interior design. But I don't know, I was like, there was a pause during COVID, and I started filling up my studio with these things and thinking about how strange it was being surrounded by this kind of space. And I began by photographing myself during moments of COVID lockdown, just reclining or resting or sleeping, thinking about different kinds of labor that could happen in this space. But after that, like, I kind of came back to thinking about the staging of it, but also something that came up with this, with the salt paper prints, was this thinking about the language of black and white photography and the ways in which a lot of our strategies of racialization also come into play. And also thinking about what you're talking about, like how the surface of the body is meant to read things. And anyways, yeah, thinking about gender as well. There's all kinds of stuff going on. I have a lot of images, and maybe I've been talking for too long, so well.
Do you want to just
Yeah.
flip? Do you want to just flip through the rest? And
Yeah, I'll go through
Anyway,
these, and
we
we
can
can
go
kind of come
quickly.
back to them. But
Yeah.
so it became a stage that started, like I tended to do, kind of accumulating things, making portraits, photographing. You know, there was just so much stuff that was happening, and it took me a few years to sort of sort it through. This project has ended after a series of exhibitions between New York, LA, and then Europe. But maybe coming to this one, this is where you can sort of see, coming back to the references to Bayard, I started bringing in cuttings and things, tools that I was using to work in my garden into the studio, along with contemporary objects, antique objects. You sort of see all this stuff happening. And then I also began thinking about the Daylight Studios transition into night, making a series of images in twilight, and then transforming the studio itself into one large dark room. And yeah, this is sort of where, because one of those images is in this space, and I think this is my last picture, so
Yep.
we'll end there.
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Stephanie. Here is her work in the exhibition. Stephanie Suyuko works in photography, sculpture, and installation, moving from handmade and craft-inspired mediums to digital editing and archive excavations. Recently, she has focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of racialized, exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. Born in the Philippines, she is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Getty Museum, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, among others. And Radius Books has recently published her book, The Unruly Archive, and she's an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, have to say go Bears, because I went there, and resides in Oakland, California. And here is one of her works. Would you like to play with the clicker too? Here is one of her works paired with a wonderful kind of album of Kodak photos that is in our collection and is in the exhibition. And Stephanie, I just have kind of a simple question for you, but just that I think you'll be able to take off with. What attracted you? I know you had a fellowship at the Smithsonian Archives, and what attracted you to wanting to go work with those archives, and what were you looking for?
Great. Okay. So can everyone hear me? Yeah. All right. Well, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be a part of this exhibition, and I think there's so many amazing overlaps, and I can't wait for the discussion. But if I were to dive into my work, I think the specifically, I just want to give some background about how I think it operates, which is my work recycles, copies, resuscitates, warps, reframes, makes do, rips off, plunders, and hinges on existing forms and historical archives because the past is still unfinished business. And so in I guess the most straightforward, response of thinking about the archive or institutional archives in specifically. So, the Smithsonian has an amazing artist research fellowship in which an artist can delve into a particular set of documents or photographs. And prior to my doing that, I also was starting to get invited to work with museum collections and, sifting through objects or images. And this particular image I want to start off with because it really does talk a lot about a kind of manufacturing of an image. This was, I worked in collaboration with the staff photographer at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art to photograph his objects that he used, so his props, his studio equipment, as the central I guess, subject of this particular stage set. And so, these are the typical kind of things that a contemporary photographer uses. And so instead of having them off to the edges, putting them in the center as the kind of frame. And what I like about this image too is that it talks about a kind of contemporary space. So we have the introduction of the green screen and thinking about how, the development of photography went from the analog to the digital. And again, so mining institutional archives or collections, a lot of my work is also, while it's pictorially based, it's also manifests as installations. And so when I'm either making, fabricating, or downloading images from the internet, and in a lot of cases, I also work with collections that are only accessible online, because you can't really always get your body to the physical archive. That can be difficult in many ways. And so what I wind up doing is creating these kind of amalgamations of both contemporary and historical images. And I'm not really going to go too far into what the meaning of this particular work is, but it kind of shows this very layered process. And I'm also thinking about how we encounter images and documents in archives. Usually they're stacks of papers or photos that you're kind of sifting through and trying to make sense of. And so as some background on what that process looks like, this is actually, the setup at, say, the Archive Center at the Smithsonian, where I would have to bring in a camera and tripod, and then over the period of weeks or even months, just go through boxes and boxes of images, just looking and seeing what I can find. In particular, the fellowship at the Smithsonian was, I was searching for evidence of the Philippines in the American archive, not because I was looking for a kind of cultural connection to where I was born, but because I wanted to see how the empire viewed its colony. And so, what are the blind spots? What are the ways in which those things actually show up or manifest? And what I found was this kind of spotty and incomplete archive, and every now and then things would kind of pop up with some kind of legibility. So this is, literally a shot of what it looks like. And how I translate it in my work, though, the 3 pieces that are here at the Getty are from a series called Pileups, and these are literally taking from the documents I found at the Smithsonian and creating these physical collages. So it's a little difficult to tell in these flat sort of digital images, but the work itself is kind of curled, and the papers are, piled onto each other, and they're sort of displayed in a shadow box scenario. And what I was really looking for were fragments. Like every now and then people would pop up. In many cases, though, I was interested in ways in which people were looking back kind of at the camera in meaningful ways, or even turning their backs to the camera. So the idea of how can you represent a country or even an entire population through what an institution holds. In many cases, it's also through the objects that they collect of that country. So, Pileup herbaria is mostly botanical things that have been accumulated. This is from the anthropology collection at the Smithsonian. And so these portraits are really based on a kind of colonial collecting mentality. It's really not, I would say, like a reflective of the country itself. So just quickly going through it, I think I'll end with an image where I'm really also interested in how the physicality of these things manifest. So my working process can get very, I guess, sculptural. I'm constantly piling papers up in the studio. I've never had a chance to really show this type of work as my work because I think it's not archival. Institutions don't really like things that aren't in frames. But I hope one day that it can manifest.
Wow, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, there's so many directions to go here.
Should I forward to the next? Is
Sure.
there another?
Let's see. What did we
Oh,
just?
nope. Okay, sorry. Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, I don't know where we want to land, but maybe as the conversation goes, we'll find a spot to jump around to. But we've shown all the images. But yeah, there's some interesting commonalities. One, I like the way Stephanie, you said that your works are amalgamations of the historic and contemporary. And obviously, for all of you, your works are amalgamations of the historic and the contemporary. And I guess in part that's what the show is about, but the show is also not necessarily, the three of you have really integrated the historic and the contemporary into your work. Is there anything you want to say about that, or a specific work you'd like to point out that we've had here? Or maybe that's just an observation too.
Make it up as I go along. Well, so the verb that I like to use when I'm, sorry, I don't know how to do this any quicker than what I'm doing, but the way I like to describe it is, and you had, I think you had used the word critical at some point in our discussion, and I like to think about, this, again, like to use this term looping, but like really thinking about my practice as being like taking a prism and looking at these things and sort of seeing all the different paths of how those images are significant, right? So like some of it is about, on like a really basic level, like how were these photographs made, right? And I think, another thing that we share is like a kind of a real interest in the photograph as a kind of material object, right? And the ways in which those objects sort of not only link us to the history and to the maker, but to like the experience of looking at it and sort of thinking about why looking at these histories, I'm just sorry. I feel like this is probably terribly distracting, but
it's hard
hopefully
to talk and click.
I just wanted to sort of, well, it's partly because I have like this was the image I wanted.
Okay.
But again, like, I wanted to speak really specifically to this experience because when I was doing the research of that image on the left, it was this like kind of deeply profound, like I'm like handling these prints, they're in cardboard boxes, there's like dust in the bottom of the boxes and little like pieces of emulsion and glass, and it was incredibly moving, and like in this way I was like, I feel like I'm sort of touching these bodies, like it really was truly like a kind of straight shot back to this thing. And I'm not interested in it being nostalgic. I'm like, I actually think it's like if we're gonna understand what we're doing today as artists, it's like that is with us, like totally in the present. And yeah, and that was kind of like why it felt really important to me to sort of make, to kind of begin with making ambrotypes, but then not to sort of necessarily stay within a material or a medium that sort of seemed antiquated, right? And I mean, and I say that, I don't think it is antiquated in any sense, but it's kind of like, how can they talk to each other? And, because the conversation feels like totally alive to me. So, would anybody else like to weigh in?
Yeah, I was thinking of that too, like what you said and then what you were talking about, the archive is like unfinished business. And sort of like accidental, I like would have, like you could not have convinced me that I would like make anything referencing the 19th century if like 5 years ago. I feel like I was in such a like post-70s, just like like a kind of like functional studio that its aesthetics were informed by other things, and it was like really interesting bringing in time. And it opened up a whole bunch of anxiety because I think at one point I was like, could I make an ambrotype? But I was like, I don't have access to like wet space and all these things. And then I was just like, I can just use a dye sublimation on aluminum. I can be in conversation with this thing. I don't need to reproduce it. But it introduced time in a different way, because I think I've always been interested in like the idea of studio time, and it kind of brings in, it can bring in archival things, it can bring in historic references, but it's always going to be in the moment. It's always going to be, and so when I started filling up the space over this year, 2021, with these objects, some of them were historic. Some of them, there were things from the 18th and 19th centuries. There were 1980s reproductions of things. There were contemporary things. I didn't want to make a reproduction of a historic space. I was interested in how it existed now, but also just the strangeness of coming into that through my subjectivity and just being like, and then it was just very strange being surrounded by all those things. And now I'm kind of glad to like set them aside and do something very different. But it was like, like you were saying something earlier about like, you know, setting aside some of the archival things, that maybe I'm divulging stuff, you know, but it feels like it became so, it introduced time in a way that I wasn't used to, and it's been really good for me to actually set it aside, but I think it's gonna keep informing.
Well, and I guess you were making a lot of these at a time when time felt so different because of the pandemic and the lockdown, and I think we all were experiencing time in a different way because of that as well.
Exactly,
yeah. Do you have something you'd like to add?
Sure, yeah. So I think that for me, the move to respond to or work with 19th century imagery was literally because there's a sort of factual historical connection between colonial photography in the Philippines, and so that's like Spanish or American photographers, but some of the earliest images you can find of Filipinos are completely through an ethnographic lens. And so that's, you know, it's kind of inescapable, actually. It's like the further back you go, that's where it takes you. And it takes a moment until, say, Filipinos are actually making images of themselves. And so, for better or for worse, the institutional and national archives usually have, you know, very specific images that I find, you know, I need to be kind of resistant toward. But as Paul was alluding to, I think after working for, 6 years now on colonial era imagery, I'm sort of starting to lay it aside, which I'm really glad for, because it's an endless, bottomless pit.
Yes, and as a person who works in a museum, we have to feel that about our collections too. Just there's so much to explore and so much to mine and so much to research and always more to do. But we're kind of already talking about this, but having seen your work in the context of this exhibition in particular, and in the company of 19th century and 21st century works, are you thinking about your work differently?
I am. I mean, I think we were actually just talking over lunch about digital photography versus analog processes. And one of the things that stands out to me regarding the exhibition is just how physical it is. You know, there's all the types of photography represented. It's amazing. It's a really wonderful teaching tool too. And so to think of ourselves in a kind of lineage, whether it's a lineage we asked for or didn't ask for in terms of, you know, how we're approaching and critiquing photography, I do like that it reminds me again that, you know, there's a materiality attached to it and not just these free-floating images that sometimes get associated with, say, digital photography today.
Yeah. How am I thinking about things? I mean, I'm always just amazed at like the kinds of intersections that you set off to do one thing and then it pulls in other things, and it's just like to be in these kinds of exhibitions where, because I think oftentimes work like ours gets on certain tracks, you know, and so to be brought together in this way is really refreshing. I feel like I've learned a lot from it, and then from those conversations that we had, because those were over about a year or so.
I feel like we started in 2020 and probably had our on Zoom, and you and I, and then Karen came into the conversation, and we came and met with you and had the conversation that became the transcript for the book probably at the end of 2022, so it's kind of 2 years, Yeah,
so it was an interesting way of learning, and I think kind of like what you mentioned, and also with your approach to the archives, it's like for Black people, for brown people, for women, for like if you go back, because we can go to the origin of photography, you can't do that for painting or sculpture, right? It's like or even writing, right? Like we can go back to the first images of ourselves, and it's like you just find nothing but things that are disturbing. Maybe that's why I avoided it for so long, but it was nice to kind of come into it and find a way of engaging in a way that felt like productive rather than repeating something. And so I'm kind of like thankful for that.
I mean, I'm in a really funny place with my work right now. In some ways, I would say in the last 20 years, like I would often sort of identify an image or a subject, all of which have been like the 19th century, and then I would sort of like be kind of spinning out the project from there. And now I actually, I'm not, I don't, there's no kind of sort of origin right now for what I'm working on, which is about, it's about menopause and women's, you know, it's like, and it's like basically about a different sort of facet of women's healthcare, but there isn't like a kind of particular hook with like an image that kind of, you know, sort of acted as a catalyst. Like that's a lot of what happens for me. Like I kind of find something and then I'm kind of unraveling it in some ways. That said, I'm like using a view camera again, which I haven't done in 20 years, which is of course like a 19th century technology. So like there's this way that even though like kind of what's happening, you know, in front of the camera is not in conversation with the history, there's something that's been happening that's much more, yeah, maybe it's just more like a kind of material technology first sort of continuation of it. But it's very, yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'll have more to say about it in a year.
I look forward to seeing it all too, yeah. Wow, we're getting a lot of questions from people on Zoom. Before I start with those or any here in the room, I just wanted to make a couple interesting points when you're talking about Bayard, and you're saying that, you know, nobody's seen the photographs that you made where you were kind of inspired by his pose and what he was doing. His 3 variants of the drowned man were in his home when he died. We don't know if anybody ever saw those either until after he died, and they become, you know, his most well-known photograph. And he too may have put those away and didn't want to, you know, maybe they were too disturbing to him as well. And in terms of thinking that you were misreading his darker skin color, yeah, he did have, in the image we see darker, at least one of the drowned man images, we see much darker hands and neck and face, and I do think it comes from his love of gardening. But he does, in the paragraph that he writes on the back of one of the the photograph that we kind of feel is I don't know, maybe what he felt was the most successful. He says, you know, here lies the corpse of Monsieur Bayard, and you better hurry to get to the morgue to see him because his hands are decaying. And that kind of, you know, that is true of any corpse, but it also was, you know, what they were hearing about drowned people too. So there is a connection there that he at least extrapolated after seeing his dark hands as well. So maybe that there was something more connected there than you'd realize. Does anybody have a question here in the room? Brian, and we have a mic coming down to you. Sorry, it's so fast. Here, let's see, we could play.
I can always just like click to things that are like relevant.
Hey, I just wanted to ask, there's always this kind of push-pull between when you're using an old process, or even as Laura just talked about, when you're using an old kind of camera, like a view camera versus a digital camera. How do you kind of deal with that when making work that's around the 19th century, right? That we're in the present, but yet we're using these old techniques or these old processes. And you want to keep them separate, but they're still coming together somehow.
Did you understand that question? Or all of you?
Looks like a not.
Okay.
It was about using 19th century technology now, and just, I think, the physical and material processes of that.
Trapped in that.
Yeah. Yeah, not being trapped in that. I mean, I was just really ambivalent about it. I think there's interesting photographers who are making work with historical processes who might be making images of very contemporary things, or I think it's one thing to use a technology in order to explore what the possibilities of that are with what's around you, and then there's the other kind of thing that I was talking about of like historical recreation, or you think about people who are like staging things, it's like a costume drama, that would then, what's visualized is not the process, but the effect. So I don't know, I don't know if any of us are trapped, or like really, you did the ambrotypes. I've played around with some cyanotypes and saltpaper prints, but I think we're all just kind of doing whatever. I just feel like using whatever technology is the right thing to accomplish what idea I have in my head.
I mean, I think a big part of it is just looking at like the way certain conventions kind of gather around a particular process or a particular technology, and just questioning like, oh, is that what I want to be doing? Like in some ways, I think people would look at my ambrotypes and be like, those aren't very good ambrotypes. They're not in focus, blah, 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 and I'm like, well, I don't really care. Like, that's not how, I guess it's sort of like distinguishing between like what's possible with any kind of given tool, and then, how it's been conventionally used and how you're kind of in dialogue with it. Like for me, like I wanted to use, like, the big part of it for me was it being glass, and it being like a body part, and it being fragile, and it being cracked and kind of, messed up. It was not about it being, sort of, I don't want to sound like a total rube, but like it's not about being like technically proficient necessarily. So I think, I was not, and not to fetishize it either, right? Like that for me is the other thing, like that kind of, it's just like another lens that I'm trying to use when I'm making decisions.
Can I ask what the actual subject of those film photographs is? Is it contemporary hands or hands from the 19th century?
They are contemporary hands, and I had isolated all the hand gestures from the archival photographs, and then I was kind of working with the subjects, and we were just kind of playing with them and like sort of thinking about signaling to people, like really, like creating a semaphore.
I think I'll add to that question about the 19th century toolkit. So one thing that's not really apparent in these images that you're seeing right now, as they're on the screen digitally, is that a lot of the images I use, they're highly pixelated. They're shitty JPEGs that I download from the internet, or I sometimes reshoot with my cell phone, but they're of old images or tools, because I'm also trying to think of the ways in which we've kind of acclimated ourselves to think we understand an old image, but yet these images still circulate in a kind of contemporary space, like digital technologies. And so if you were to go see this in the galleries, you'll notice that it's not 19th century, or it is paired with a kind of contemporary lens.
Okay, any other questions here? Yep.
Hi, I had a question for Laura. I was curious to know your trajectory working with these 19th century photographs of like women that were diagnosed with hysteria, and then leading into these photographs that are referencing folks like Simone Forti and things of that nature. I saw the one titled like Huddle. I'm curious to know what led you into that, like what transitioned into that.
Yeah, so part of it was the archival photograph. Hi. The archival photographs were meant to be diagnostic. So like a physician, if they saw a woman going like this, they would know a woman is in, like the ecstatic phase of a hysterical fit, right? And so it was this kind of breaking down of the gesture in terms of trying, sort of understanding a pathology. And Yvonne Rainer is a really important figure for me when I was a student, and and she was actually looking at a lot of these photographs. So that was probably like the initial path to the Judson Group, and but she was also really interested in this sort of idea of like breaking down these movements, right, and then kind of repeating them, figuring out how to kind of choreograph, like with that sort of approach to, to sort of breaking down movements. And so that's like, that's like the very sort of literal answer here, but that there, again, my interest in the photographs was really thinking about, like, on some level, who these women were, what their lives were like, and trying to sort of critically imagine a kind of dimensional life for them that did not, that acknowledged that they were suffering, maybe not on the terms that the doctor was, assigning to them, but that they had connections to people within the hospital, they had connections to people outside of the hospital, that there were like daily acts of resistance and rebellion that were not part of the history. And then, again, leaping forward to the Judson Group, it was like this massive resistance to these very kind of conservatory models of dance, right? And it was very much about like embracing the sort of like the everyday movements of a body, and oftentimes like with a real attention to female women's bodies. And so that was kind of, that for me was the triangle.
And a quick question from Zoom that kind of fits in with your work, Laura, too. Just somebody's asked who was taking the pictures in the 19th century with Dr. Charcot. They were professional photographers, or they weren't doctors.
They were his students.
Okay, so they
they were his students, and they. I don't sort of know the background about their training, but they did learn how to make photographs, but they were doctors. So
okay, they were.
Yeah,
wow.
so Albert Lund
Wow.
and Paul Renard.
Right.
And that's what's in the exhibition.
Yep. And Paul, can you speak about the use of red in your portraits?
Oh.
Would it be
Yeah.
an extension of that? Would it be a stretch to suggest a connection to Delacroix's use of red?
Oh, I hadn't thought about Delacroix. What is, maybe if the person can specify what the, I mean, before this project, I had been doing a body of work from like 2016 to like 2021 called Dark Room. And so I'd been playing around with the structures of photography as thinking back to the understood impropriety of the photographer going under the dark cloth. And there's a whole series of 19th century photographic jokes about that and going up a woman's hoop skirts, all the way to a direct line to thinking about the privileged position. It kind of goes from like Fragonard's paintings of like the the lover who's like in the bushes, who's like looking up up the woman's skirt as her husband's pushing him on the swing. That's like a photograph. That's like a point perspective thing. That's also the thing I'm really interested in photography. But also, there's all these ways in which like this idea of entering into these spaces, being in front of or behind the curtain, extending into the backdrops, thinking about that in terms of like queer, social, sexual spaces, darkroom spaces. I'd been doing all of that, but in daylight studios. Thinking about, anyways, so when I moved to these spaces and I had kind of like set this up, I was also looking at images of early darkrooms, and some of them were like traveling darkrooms, and they're quite large, and I was there's these interesting diagrams, and I was like, let me make a new kind of darkroom image, and so I went out and I got actual darkroom bulbs, and but they were like 6 watts. The exposures were incredibly long, so some of the earlier ones, the figures are all blurred, and so by the time I made these ones later in 2022, I had switched to LED ones that I could dial into that exact same red. But again, another reason why I kind of like brought this forward was thinking about my introduction and formation in photography as an adolescent and taking learning darkroom photography at UC Riverside one summer in high school, and having this darkroom in the garage that was like this incredibly private but exciting space, and kind of connecting the initial interest and drive in photography, a kind of like anticipation, or we have sort of like a script for anticipation, but also for any photographer who's learned making work in an analog way, you know how to read images and anticipate them in different conditions of light. And I was connecting that, sorry, this is a long loop, to thinking about darkrooms, like gay darkrooms. And I was looking at a lot of images of bathhouses, saunas, clubs. I mean, I was looking at all these different conditions of lighting. So I was interested in the ways in which a lot of queer social formation takes place in nightlife, in dark rooms, that these initial points of reading, of touch, of sensory experiences are formed there and then taken into the daylight. So I was kind of interested in like making my entire studio a dark room, and it was interesting to see in ways in which like friends just knew what to do. Like you just kind of get keyed in, you walk like, it's not like it was like a music, or I think sometimes, I don't know, we might be just like listening to whatever's on the radio or something, not radio, spot, I don't know, whatever. But it was just like it was like a space. So that's how I came into it. I'm not sure what the Delacroix reference is, but there was all these threads that were kind of coming together, and I did a series of them on the plates because I was interested in the ways in which they kind of might reference some other things. So yeah. And then I have a show that's up right now in Chicago where I started making these simultaneous with blue light images. But again, the blue light images do something different. There's not a possibility of producing analog photographs in that space.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess we've got about 5 more minutes, and Arturo Soda asked a really interesting question on Zoom, which I think I'd like to extend as well. But he says, what would you like the legacy of the exhibition to be? And I guess as a curator of the show, I hope that people see that history is relevant, 19th century photography is relevant, that we have a lot in common with people almost 200 years ago. And as artists are often thinking about some of the same things, and looking at and exploring those images can be inspiring, can be upsetting, can make you question, critique, and really, they're great fodder for art. I guess I hope that that's the legacy. And I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. And also, you're all teachers. So what how can you convey some of this idea of the 19th century and 20th century to your students, and give that legacy of one of your art forms to your students?
I'll pick that up in the sense that, similar to what I was saying of how what I appreciated about the exhibition is its kind of materiality in the things on display. It also divides up the images and contextualizes them in such a way that you can see the production of the terms of photography in a social and political light, which I really appreciate, because I think, you know, there's that kind of common tendency just to think like, oh, photography is just a, you know, reflection of reality. And obviously, you know, we all know that's not true, but it's nice to see those systems literally kind of like laid out, right? Like that photographers were inventing the kind of norms around the discipline at the time. And so, you know, 180 years later, we're still talking back to those norms, or, you know, being on, in resistance to it. And so I think that's what I would choose as an educator to kind of like shape for my students.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, maybe I'll just kind of bounce off that by saying that something that happens with teaching sometimes is there's a little bit of resistance to like looking at history, or even, you know, like there's this idea that when you're an artist, you're kind of like in your own little headspace making things, and that, you know, it's like a really profound and generative conversation to be having just with things that you love, and that's a way in to making work. And it's also a way into sort of being able, I don't know, to think about your work in some expansive terms as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe I'll give some shout out to some students, like current and former students and friends and stuff like that. Yeah, teaching is wild. But I think it's like we all end up making photographs, but we don't think about how and why we picked up the things that we're doing. So it's really nice to to draw those threads. Like, I think there's still so much more for photography to do. And I'm not like a medium specific person, but I'm just like, photographs, I just want to stick with photographs. And so and also something that this process has kind of taught me is that, like, yeah, sometimes I do get in my own head and I'm just like going forward on this thing, but it's nice to be reminded that, like, no, everything that I'm picking up, I'm pulling together the threads from conversations that have happened before, and we can just sort of like transform them. And photography is really amazing because I think we can go to some of those origins. But the thing that I was always interested in the studio specifically was how photography didn't actually start from nothing. It's inheriting everything from the construction of the painter's studio, and then everything around how and why even the optics are, you know, it comes from all of these other decisions that were made along the way, that are informed by architecture, that are informed by geographers, that are informed by all these other things. So, but at least in photography, we have a point of, like, we have an ability to kind of go to those first documents. And how amazing it is to be like in a show with like some of the first
Right.
Like, this is like,
Right.
why I was like, this is
Yeah,
wild.
yeah. I'm so excited that
Yeah.
these two shows are together too.
Yeah.
Well, what a lovely way to end this conversation. Thank you all for coming here in the room and in Zoom land. And please join us on Thursday, June 6th at noon for an art break. It's a 30-minute conversation with another artist from this exhibition, Phil Chang. And that one is online only, solely, so you can actually really just make it a lunch break or something. Please come to that. And let's give a round of applause for our amazing artists today. Thank you. Thank you.